seeps in for this segment of the event. As a lawyer-to-be, I have the chance to come across and interpret various pieces of legislation, case law, and procedural aspects. But I can't help but think that while everything's been set out for us, considering it draws from the past, with law and cannabis on the other hand, considering how fresh and nascent it still is as a field, we have the chance to see the entire genesis of legislation, the setting of precedent, and watch it cascade to issues of impact and implementation. Uniquely enough, in this regard, the law becomes future-facing. As a result, you end up having a much more refined legal perspective. You genuinely know where it all comes from and what makes it tick. Dr. B.R. Ambedkar said that law and order are the medicine of the body politic, and when the body politic gets sick, medicine must be administered. It seems only appropriate to quote an eminent lawyer and jurist at this point, because how interesting a color his words acquire when we apply it to the present context. While laws provide that essential framework, like a skeleton, a cause or principle of action eventually trickles down to policy, and it is therefore in essence the lifeblood. As we set out to discuss policy for medicine, I marvel at how, by achieving its true impact, in this case, policy itself could be medicine. Our learned policy panel will comprise Mr. Tjalling Erkelens, Mr. A.P. Kala, and Mr. Romesh Bhattacharji. Mr. A.P. Kala has handled some of the most sensitive assignments during his career in the Indian Revenue Service, before his retirement as Director General of the Central Economic Intelligence Bureau in 2010. He was also rewarded the President of India Republic Day Award for Distinguished Record of Service and Devotion to Duty. Mr. Romesh Bhattacharji has been the front-runner in the formulation and implementation of the National Narcotic Policy, supervision of legal poppy cultivation, and the detection and destruction of illicit poppy cultivation in India. He has also served as a consultant for the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime during Afghanistan's opium crisis. Please welcome our policy panel on stage.
Check, mic check. Once again, my name is Jahan Preston Jamis. I'll be moderating this session. And I think what we'll do is we'll begin by getting a little more perspective from Tjalling about the basic understanding of, now we know about Netherlands. Now we have a very good understanding of how the system has worked in the Netherlands and how broadly it's worked in other countries. But beyond that, from your side, from your experience, from your countless years actually working in the domain of cannabis, where have you seen policy go from, and where do you think it's come to at this point in time across different countries? If you could give us your perspective on that.
Initially, I would say that in the beginning, when the policy started in the Netherlands, it was actually trying to solve problems. In that time, medicinal cannabis for its medicinal properties was not that well known. It was basically all based on patient experiences. What you see happening over time also in the Netherlands is that they are tightening up the rules and regulations. They are separating more and way better the use of recreational cannabis, the recreational use of cannabis and the medicinal use of cannabis. They try to do that, and what you see happening around the world is basically the same thing. The separation of medicinal and recreational cannabis is becoming more clear to people, where the science actually brings the medical cannabis to another level.
Right.
You see policy adjusting to that.
Most definitely. Along with that, I just wanted to get a little more of your understanding, and post that we can get to Mr. Kala and Mr. Bhattacharji's opinion about this, is where do you think the next innovation of policy regime can be best represented for cannabis? Now, of course, all across the world, several countries have opium policies. In fact, India itself, as we've continuously mentioned, repeatedly mentioned, has a culture of opium. But it's not gone in the direction that many would have hoped for from an operational policy domain. Where do you think cannabis can pick up where other medicinal plants, say like opium, left off in terms of innovating with policy and looking at something a lot more unique in terms of its flavor?
Cool. This is a hard question.
Sorry, I asked difficult questions.
Yeah, of course, cannabis. If you go to the what is proven now in cannabis science, basically, is that there is a field, there's a part in the human body that can be where cannabis is active. There's a receptor system, the endocannabinoid system, that has been laid out quite properly now. People start to understand what is happening there. That makes it easier to create a policy around it. The question is whether you allow herbal cannabis, for instance, to the market, whether you want only single compounds out of cannabis going to the market. Those are the major questions you see countries and you see regulators dealing with nowadays. And there are different opinions on that. There are countries where they say, just give them standardized or not even cannabis that as a medicine. Like in Canada, they just do it outside the pharmaceutical system. They created a parallel system for that, where in a country like Australia, they just want to do it inside now. They are starting their regulation right now. And I must say that in the Netherlands, where the regulation is already way older, we see not a defined path moving ahead. The original policy of our Minister of Health in those years was that, well, cannabis does something, there is medical value in it, we should research it, and we should find proper medicines. Actually, herbal cannabis in the Netherlands is still an intermediate between a registered medicine in the end and the actual herb itself and its medical value, and where patients are able to access it now as a medicine. How do you say it? As a medicine for compassionate use. So the end game in the Netherlands is also to create actual registered medicine, clinically tested, blah blah blah, the whole thing.
Mr. Kala, I'd like to get your thoughts broadly about where do you think India as a country has come? Where do you think we've evolved to in terms of speaking about and engaging in dialogue related to this type of policy?
First of all, I think we really need to understand the regulatory regime in India and where it's got us. Now, what's happened is that in implementing regulations and controls, we've sort of emphasized excessively on the restrictive and the prohibitory aspects. Now, what we've forgotten, both while formulating policy and while implementing policy, is that if you look at the NDPS Act, now the entire scheme of the NDPS Act is subject to a rider. That the prohibitions and controls envisaged in the Act are subject to the rider except for medicinal and scientific purposes. But in actually working the Act, this rider, which is fundamental to the Act, has actually been lost sight of totally. So it's only if you take that away and just impose controls, so you have the situation which you have in India today. Now the point is, if that rider, which runs through the entire scheme of the Act, is to be really implemented, Then for any particular initiative, whether it relates to cannabis, for its commercial use, for its medical use, its scientific use, etc., it's got to be backed by very credible, like Dr. Agarwal said during the earlier panel, by very credible scientific and medical evidence. If you look at our country, I'll just cite an example which is not really about drugs. You look at genetically modified crops, and you see that there are many countries in the world where they are accepted. We import genetically modified crops. But in actually, except for BT cotton, if you look at anything else, there is a huge controversy on, and the government for years is not able to decide, despite a lot of evidence that these do not constitute any hazard, and maybe some evidence which is not very clear that they might be hazardous. Or the point is that when we come to drugs, we are coming into a much more difficult area. So the evidence which must be presented, the evidence which the scientific and medical evidence which needs to be produced in order to effect a change in direction or a change in policy, needs to be extremely credible. It needs to be extremely well-founded. It needs to be well-researched, and it needs to be tested. So what I would say is that any organization or group which propagates this idea really needs to focus in those areas, because the law allows it. It's not that the law doesn't allow it, but unless you bring that evidence, it's not going to happen.
Most definitely.
Thank you.
Mr. Bhattacharji, if we could get your thoughts broadly about the policy regime, the domain, and from your experience, where you think
I step out of this policy and techniques for a while and talk of my experience with real life.
Perfect.
I have prepared a small statement. I'll read that out.
Perfect.
So, therapeutic use of cannabis in India is 1,000 years old, at least. It has been written about since the 14th century. And despite the tough NDPS Act, it is used even today, showing how ineffective this act has been. Medicinal use of cannabis has increased immensely all over India since the beginning of this century. That means since 2000. Perhaps allopathic medicine was not accessible to many, or in hopeless cases was of no use in relieving pain. Cannabis grows in about 400 of the 640 districts in India. Its medicinal use is spreading all over the country. I have seen it being used to treat humans and animals in villages of northwest and northeast of India. It grows in the other parts, but I have no experience of that. In urban India too, medicinal use of cannabis is spreading for hopefully checking serious ailments that conventional medicine sometimes fails in, from cancer to hepatitis. In addition, it is a potent pain reliever. Recently, I discovered that cannabis oil is being used to help patients of terminal diseases. I am told that in every city of India, cannabis-based relief is available. But because this good work is illegal, the cost is unaffordable for many. A bottle of 15 milliliters of cannabis oil costs rupees 15,000. This is a weird situation. On one hand, cannabis has the undeniable capacity to do some good, while on the other, the law punishes its practitioners. If the NDPS Act has failed to restrain the black market medicinal use of cannabis, it is time that it is reformed. For people are using, getting relief, and sometimes being cured by cannabis anyhow. That's the thing. Now I can answer questions.
Right. So this is, I think, a fantastic precursor, and it touches upon a lot of what many people have spoken about today, and it's highly relevant. I think the statistic that stands out is close to 400 out of, say, 600, 650 districts.
Maybe even more now.
Maybe even more now. And it really begs to ask the question, sir, that where do you think ministries, departments that were in charge of this, that the laws and the regulatory regimes that exist now, do you think that they're too forbearing? And do you think that some degree of liberalization through dialogue needs to be explored a lot more from a ministry and department angle?
Bureaucracy is averse to taking risks. They'll take them 6 decades or so to move in an inch. So, we'll have to give them time and keep badgering them with these ideas. hopefully later on it might change.
Certainly, certainly. In fact, Mr. Erkelens, if you could give us your perception of actually engaging with other countries, going to the likes of Czech Republic, Australia, a variety of countries, and was the attitude of the bureaucrats prohibitive at first, and how did you overcome these types of hurdles when dealing with them?
Yeah, the bureaucrats are, the regulators, as I call them, are having sometimes serious difficulties with understanding what is going on, even going beyond what their politicians actually want. We have seen, we are seeing an example of that right now happening in the Czech Republic, where there was access to cannabis. First of all, the Czech Republic also has ancient use of cannabis. They are very familiar with the product there. The interesting part is that the elderly people, most of them are growing it themselves on their balcony, in their garden. They're making ointments out of it. They don't inhale, but they're just making ointments out of it. So it's a very well-known older product there as well. However, the regulators are basically now blocking access to patients on a regulated basis because simply they will never tell you exactly, but they basically don't like it. Well, while even their Minister of Health is promoting production of cannabis and cannabis medicines, especially working towards a system in which cannabis can be used as a registered medicine in the end. The regulators are opposed to it because, tell me why. We don't know exactly why. But that's one of the worst examples, I would say. If I look into a situation in Australia, the regulators there are cooperative. They really want to do. They really want to help. However, they find all the little details and all the things you have to comply with. Oh, and the law is not up to that, and the law should be there. And you see also the problem there, the federal and state level. So where India as a federation is something to consider also very well, because from the UN perspective, India will be seen as a federal country. UN is requiring a policy in which production of the herbal material itself is controlled by the federal government, and then what you see happening in Australia is that state governments actually allow access to products or not, and on which conditions. So that makes it also hard to deal with certain situations.
Yes, Mr. Kal, please.
I think, just point on the federal and the state issue. Even in India, if you look at the NDPS Act, Section 8 deals with the regulations and controls to be implemented by the central government, and Section 10 by the state government.
Yes.
Now you will see there's a fair degree of overlap between the two. Number one. Number two, this overlap means that there is a lack of clarity. Very often one wouldn't know whether to go to the federal government or to a state government on issue X or issue Y. So it's important for us also, what my fellow panelists said. It's important in India also to be clear on this, that what rests with the center and what rests with the state. Otherwise, at the practical level, there could be problems in implementation.
Coming back to you, Mr. Kala and Mr. Bhattacharji, I think it would be very relevant to get your opinions. Of course, you mentioned that the lack of clarity. What steps do you believe need to be taken to reinforce that confidence within the right kind of state governments, the right kind of action makers, so to speak, to make cannabis happen, wherein which the confidence is equally inspired within the relevant ministries or offices of, say, narcotics or relevant excise offices? What do you think it would take to get us to that point?
I would suggest a lot of discussion first. There has been very little discussion in the ministries about this point, about reform, about change. They're still sticking to, whatever was imposed on them since 1961. They haven't had time to refashion their views yet.
Yeah, I'll just add to that. There is coordination between the center and the states, but the coordination is almost exclusively on enforcement.
Yes.
It's police coordination.
Yes.
There is hardly any discussion on amendments relating to the Act, on amendments relating to the rules and regulations, on bringing out clarity on what falls in the domain of the states and what falls in the domain of the central government.
Of course.
So I think what's needed really is some kind of a démarche to the central government to engage with the states on these issues, maybe from institutions and organizations such as yours, or those concerned with rehabilitation issues and or research and medicine, and based on that, unless there's a dialogue between the center and the states, this thing is not going to change.
Certainly. In fact, Mr. Kala, you raised a very relevant point, and I'd like to throw it open to all three panelists from all your perspectives. Do you think the time is slowly approaching where India and the relevant ministries need to sit down and really think about whether we actually need a national cannabis policy which can actually govern the central and state relationship and what comes next for the future, with the relevant amendments or development or upgrade of an NDPS Act? Do you think that form of an idea or realm of idea would be good, or do you think something else could be worth exploring?
Well, not alone, not cannabis alone.
Yes.
But the whole Act has to be reformed.
Definitely.
That is why cannabis will be a part of it.
Certainly, certainly.
So just to stick to concentrate on cannabis is the wrong idea.
Definitely.
But we can use it as in the vanguard.
Yes, absolutely. Mr. Erkelens, do you have any thoughts about this?
Cannabis is obviously a controlled substance, so that makes it a little bit different compared to the rest. Where cannabis policy around the world is basically quite chaotic. It's what I already said. And not many countries don't know exactly what to do in certain ways. It will be very necessary to sit down, and especially in a large country like India, it will be necessary to sit down with a core group of people and try to phrase something or try to write down something that makes sense. And I think you have to start from top down. So it's where it is a controlled substance, you have to face the international treaties first before you can go to a national policy. If you don't adhere to the international treaties first, then you might be in trouble down the road. So that's where it all starts. You have to be in compliance with the international treaties, and from there it trickles down to a national policy. And whatever that national policy will look like, if it adheres to the international treaties, you can find a way any way you like in that regard. We are talking about standardized cannabis, but it might not even be necessary to do it that way.
Correct.
But that everything needs to happen top down, basically.
Certainly. Yes, sir.
In India, I think we don't even recognize cannabis as a problem. See, in the World Drug Report published by the UNODC every year, they show that cannabis cultivation is nil. Whereas actually it ought to be about around or at least 200,000 hectares.
Oh, that's correct.
And we are blind to it, willfully blind to it, and we don't recognize it. So first we have to accept that there is a blooming problem, and then carry on from there. So to convince the bureaucracy and policymakers to do that, we have to go through a lot of process of discussion.
That's a very interesting point, sir. In fact, once again, I'd like to throw it open to all of you that we've seen gradually over time, and it's a phenomenon, I thought I'll share it with you, is a lot of the geostrategic and the security-based angle of national security, state security, and the potential for compromise, wherein which extremist groups are actually funding themselves through illicit sale and cultivation of plants like cannabis. Especially in, say, Odisha, where the Maoists and the Naxal menace is at its peak, and a large amount of their revenue is actually coming from illicit cultivation. My question to all of you, and just to get your perspective on this, is, do you believe that this sort of dialogue is the first step that's required as a tool to combat the relevant criminal presence and the extremist presence that is attached to the illicit cannabis cultivation. And more importantly, do you believe there is a methodology through your experience where the right enterprises and the right actionable people can go into the villages and actually make the right pitch or the right case for harnessing its potential of this cannabis cultivation?
Look, I don't know much about, can't say much about involvement of terrorism with narcotics, but I can say that thousands of people, ordinary people, innocent people, are being criminalized because of this blooming act.
True.
You see, in Punjab, I filed a what's it called, right to information application in 2012, and I found that from 2001 to 2011, 25,003 people were sentenced to various terms of imprisonment in Punjab. They are in jails. They are about 1/7 of the total population in prisons in Punjab, and most of them, 25,003 is a figure, remember, and less than 10 were couriers and traffickers. The rest were all users. So just imagine, for such a small activity, harmless activity, they're not troubling anyone, they are being criminalized. So this is something that we have to realize. And it is also in Delhi, it's in Maharashtra, everywhere. So this is a very big problem, and first we have to address this, and then talk about criminalization and terrorism's involvement in all this.
Certainly, certainly. Mr. Kala, do you have any thoughts on harnessing that element of potential and adding on to the thoughts of the other panelists?
There's, let me put it this way, there's no data on the correlation between drugs money and the financing of terrorism. This is something like, it's something which is generally believed, but in real terms one has not come across any concrete data on this. And I may also say very few actual cases where there was a possibility of drugs money being used to finance a terrorist group or a terrorist organization. Although, as you said, this is a clear focus area for the government. Not only in the context of the Maoist groups, but also in the India-Pakistan context.
Of course.
Because there's a lot of opium and heroin coming in from that side. So, certainly it's not that government is unaware of this, that this could be a problem. But I don't think there is a need really to go this route to talk about what changes need to be made in the law, in the act, or specifically in rules or regulations relating to cannabis. I don't think this is the route to take, really. The route really is the scientific, medicinal. That is the route.
Of course. And of course, through the huge, ample amount of scientific information and data, coming from, of course, the governmental sphere and the angle, through your experience, if you could help us as the audience understand what form of representation of this scientific information and validity carries forward into the mind of the right civil officers and government officers to make that positive decision. Do you think it contributes immensely, or do you feel it's the only form of contribution that would be required?
No, it's not the only form of contribution. I think the key lies in raising the subject.
Certainly.
As something which needs to be discussed.
Yes. Certainly.
And once you've done that, if there is a formal discussion, if there's a formal need for the government to take a view or to make an amendment in the law, then where you really need to lobby is in the parliamentary committee, which will examine the whole thing. So it's first I think the first step is to get the process going.
Certainly.
And for that, I think the best way to do it is to put together the scientific and the medical evidence and go to the scientific and medical establishments of the government of India.
Certainly.
And through them to the branches which make the laws.
Absolutely.
That should be the route, I think.
Definitely. I think that's absolutely a fantastic vision you laid about. I have one last element from my side, and then we'll open it up to the audience as well. The final element, of course, once again, to all panelists, because all your views are quite fantastic and intriguing in many different senses. Now, Mr. Kala, just coming back to one point you mentioned, that because of the concurrent nature, where central government and state government both are equally responsible for certain elements of narcotics, do you feel the line that is drawn for the objective responsibilities or the role a central or state government office plays in, say, narcotic, not just implementation or seizure, but in exploration and innovation from that side, do you feel that those lines can be a lot more clearer?
Yes, and that is my point actually.
Fantastic. And how so do you think that can be brought about? Majorly because, of course, there's always an impediment and hurdle when going to the government and to the bureaucracy in identifying a role for the government officer to play. There's the element of course, a personal ego management and the larger realm of what the office does as well. How do you think these can be overcome?
No, I think what you need to do there really is to go to the exact sections of the law,
Right.
where there is a scope for confusion or a scope for different interpretations.
Of course.
Point out those discrepancies
Certainly.
to the central government, suggest what you want to suggest, and then ask for clarifications. And that's how the process starts. It's not going to be easy, as Mr. Bhattacharji said. It will take time.
Of course.
But it's certainly something which can be set in motion.
Definitely. Mr. Bhattacharji, if we could get your thoughts adding on top of that, would you have any extra thoughts to add to this?
Yeah, I think the process, discussions have started.
Yes.
In this parliament session, I think an MP has moved a bill for reform of these laws.
Yes, Dr. Dharamveer Gandhi.
Yes, Dr. Gandhi, Mr. Gandhi
Yes.
from Punjab.
Yes.
I think let's hope. It will take time. It will be resisted by the bureaucrats. But still, I think it's good news that it has started.
And Mr. Erkelens, before we head to the crowd, I'd like to get your view that engaging with other countries, did you feel yourself in a unique position where you would have to go out and objectively identify to the government officer that his role would be ABC, your role would be DEF, and somebody else's role would be GHI?
Oh yes, definitely. It is how it works. Everybody has a defined role.
Yes.
And if don't step into the role of each other.
Yes.
In the end, it's like a game of football. If you have your players on the right place in the field, you can start kicking the ball towards each other, and you are able to score in the end. And the same applies to here. So you need your regulators, but you also need the politicians. But you also need the experts in the field.
Certainly.
And there are several expert groups that really need to be involved in this. But there is an order of things. So I think first of all, what you need is create a situation in which, let's say, science can act as the referee of everything. I think that science, on any level, science will move the whole situation forward, but there needs to be created a platform for science to operate on. As long as that is not there, it will be very hard, and Arno already said it previously, many scientists are frustrated because their government is not cooperating. They don't want to do this, they block this, and then it stops for the scientists also. So once you are there and science can do its work, then you can go over to industry, and industry can create the products needed there.
Fantastic. So I guess we throw open the floor to any questions, queries, comments, recommendations, observations.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon. So I just have a question. I think the United States of America has a big role in all these policies and stuff, because in India, as Sir said, like it's been for 1,000 years, we knew about the medical and the scientific things. America comes up and says, okay, it's bad, and then we have all these acts and all these things in place, and now America is coming up again, and now the whole world started. So do you think that the United States of America has a big role to play for all these policies.
Yes, if you look into the international political situation, the US has always played a very big role, and they always have been opposing anything that happened with, especially with cannabis in that regard. And there's still some trouble there. I know that, for instance, in the WHO, they try to start up a discussion around cannabis as a medicine, but it's still being blocked internally there. It's hard to get through. However, in the US, the discussion is changing. Last year, it was very interesting to see how the National Institute on Drug Abuse actually started revising their view upon cannabis and actually is now diving into it, not into the, they did a lot in the abuse potential of cannabis, but they are now also taking up the effort of looking into the medicinal value of cannabis. And that is a real change. They announced it officially earlier this year. So if NIDA, which is a federal institute and an important one in this regard in the US, is doing that, and only recently the DEA, the Drug Enforcement Agency of the United States, allowed universities actually to start up research, to start up production even within the university, within the university itself, to start production of cannabis. For that purpose of research, there is a change coming up now, and it's what I referred to in the beginning when I said we need, on the international level first, we need to agree all on where we are heading, and if we can agree there, then it trickles down to the individual member states of the UN, and India is one of the member states. So the other thing just mentioned here is personal use of cannabis now, and the effort being put into arresting individuals only because they use cannabis. We see that that step of decriminalization in the Western world has been largely taken now. It's open for discussion always, whether you do it this way or that way. But to me, it always makes more sense if you think something is not the right way of doing things, that you actually pick up the pushers and the traffickers of that instead of the users of the product. Mostly the users are quite poor people who have no other part in their life that makes them happy. So that's another subject indeed. But so far.
Mr. Kala, Mr. Bhattacharji, would you have anything to add from an Indian perspective of how you feel?
I have a question. Sure. Yeah. So my question is related to how important is the role of an independent regulator? Let's say like the Department of Health is a regulator, and under that, in the Dutch system, they have the Office of Medical Cannabis. So having an institutional body that works like a regulator, is it more of a benefit that it offers to the whole system? Whereas like in an Indian system where it's all muddled up in narcotics, excise, interstate, would it make more sense for us to have like an individual or an independent regulator?
The regulating role of the OMC is basically very physical. It's not science-based so much, although in the beginning it was said that they would have a scientific role, but they actually not picking it up because they, due to political influence later on, they said, no, the science is for the science and the industry. We are only there to actually provide products. And do it the right way. So have the right controls and everything, and prohibit diversion, etc., etc. It would be, however, very valuable to have in a country an organization that plays a central role, and it would definitely have regulators among them. And it could be done entirely from a government situation, but it needs to be politically supported to enter also into the scientific part and to support the scientific part as a basis for moving on and having the product regulated the right way. I would applaud that, but what I still see in the bigger countries where cannabis is a product right now, like in the US, the regulators have a very standoff approach because they think there's a lot of money flowing around in cannabis industry, so that industry should support itself. It's the approach they are taking. To my mind, especially when you see cannabis as a medicine being picked up that way, it cannot be done by pharmaceutical industry because it's not patentable. It's a plant. You cannot earn huge amounts of money due to the fact that you have patents. So I think there is still a governmental responsibility also in that. If you, as a government, allow the product to the market, there should be some additional support somehow, basically on the scientific level, to make that happen. But that is how I see it happen now. Yeah.
Just to add to that, in India, the Drugs Controller General of India is the independent regulator as far as the pharmaceutical uses of drugs are concerned.
Dr. James.
Yeah, but even he is subject to the NDPS Act.
Yes, Dr. Alok.
My question is actually in relation to this. So you had mentioned that in order for the regulator to consider permitting medical use of cannabis, we have to generate enough scientific evidence for its effectiveness as well as indications and other things. But in order to do that, we need to carry out scientific research on it. And even that is controlled under the NDPS Act, and like you said, the regulator is also under the purview of the Act. So how difficult or easy is it to actually, for an academic institution, research institution like ours, to say collaborate with the industry and carry out scientific research in this area, because we will have to require permission for the same molecules which are currently prohibited.
Yeah, you can get permission on a case-by-case basis.
I mean,
You can.
I mean, generally, is it sort of, is the regulator permissive or restrictive with regards to, allowances?
It is given. I won't say it's easy, but if a good case is made out, it is given.
Sir, have you given any permission for growth of cannabis or research of cannabis in India till now?
No, to my memory, I don't know if any request has been received for cannabis,
Yeah,
but for opium, and I know that, but for opium and heroin and certain experiments to be carried out on it, in specific cases, permission has been given.
Permission has been given. There's a Defense Research Laboratory in Chandigarh. They have got permission to cultivate cannabis. And they have been doing it for the past 20 years at least.
So, my curiosity permits me to ask this one key question. Do you think that's a sustainable mechanism where if on a case-by-case basis, if this were to be approached, it would require constant efforts by one party, and it would be a consistent impediment and hurdle? Do you think these impediments could be cleared in a better manner? And if so, how do you think this could happen, sir?
I don't know. I don't think that you would get a general broad spectrum permission to do X or Y or Z. No. It will have to be on a case-by-case basis. Maybe it could be based on a research project for certain quantities for, that sort of thing, and not each day or every week you need permission. But I don't think you'd be able to get a broad spectrum permission that, okay, with X quantity of cannabis, I want to do this for the next 1 year. No, that sort of thing is not likely.
Yes.
So, continuing the same topic of discussion. So this is a question to the Dutch government. So we were actually talking about taking feedback from the consumers, right? About there was a mention of amnesia haze. So you also have a regulating authority. So how does it work when you go to the consumers and basically get information on how they were treated and yet not come under the purview of the regulating authority?
We are in a difficult position. We are in a tight spot in that regard. So we use the information we get from consumers to transfer that basically into science. It's what Arno told you also earlier. We don't take anything for granted. But the policy is in that regard is simple. If if you hear something from one individual telling you it does this or that, cannabis works in a certain way, that's interesting information, but it's only in one situation. But if there are 10 or 20 people telling the same story independently from each other, that's where science gets interested and where you have to start researching things. The Dutch government has been open to these arguments being made there. But we had to really make cases out of it, actually, to be able to come with new varieties. So if you see what we are doing now to have different varieties in the market, every variety by itself has been kind of a fight to get it into. The other thing is that we, with regard to the chemical composition of those varieties, we always have been trying to indeed listen to what the demand was from the market, from patients, but also from scientists saying we need CBD at some point. So we cultivated in that direction, and we did some things there. But it's a slow process. Let me tell you that. It's once you hear, you cannot take anything just for granted. You have to research it properly and then go step by step into the process. Arno?
Well, as a scientist myself, I have to say that very often, actually, unfortunately, scientists don't ask the smartest questions either. Because there's a lot of requests for doing science, and they're not often granted, but it's because very often the research proposals are very weak. And I know that because we had a lot of experience with thinking about clinical trials, and we knew the material very well, we started to get involved with clients who said, can I order Bedrocan Cannabis because I want to do a study? And then we said, well, but what are you going to study? Because if you prove in a clinical trial that our material doesn't work for pain, then maybe that's also because your trial isn't good. So what are you going to do with it? So they gave us permission, I think we've done it now more than 15 times, to look at the protocol. And then if you read the protocol and then see, about placebo, about blinding, about dosing, about administration forms, there's a lot of mistakes that are being made. And a big example in the beginning was that physicians were making cannabis tea and giving it to MS patients for a whole week, and they concluded, oh, it doesn't work. And then I asked, well, how did you make the tea? Did you make a big amount of tea or fresh tea every day? We make a big amount and we store it in the fridge. I said, well, then your cannabinoids are now sticking to your glass and you're just drinking green water. So no, that doesn't work. And they almost published it. So if they would have done that, then a really bad study would have become a scientific fact. So regulators often see those studies, funding agencies and organizations that have to grant permission, but the study isn't really that great. So I think, once again, it's kind of a group effort, because it's difficult. Usually, when you do a clinical trial, the medicine is already finished. It's in a package. You just have to put the pill in the patient's mouth, and that's the trial. But you don't have to think about making the medicine. That's a new role for clinical researchers. They never do that. And what about the quality control? Who's doing that? So scientists, they sometimes mean well, but they don't always get there because they have to get smarter as well. So once again, this is something that everybody has to learn to deal with. So if the research is denied, doesn't mean the government is trying to deny it. It just means that sometimes the quality needs to go up.
Right. So continuing, so what I was really talking about is how the criminal aspect of it is. So when you say that you've picked up something from the street, it is actually saying that this is something being used against the regulations. So let's just say when we talk of a so that is one example that we have in India. We have something called Mulana cream. Now, if I go about saying that this is something that I've picked up, this is something that I've used, it's basically just giving you evidence that this is something that I've done against the laws or the rules of the government, right?
The situation in Holland is slightly different, where the use of there is limited use of cannabis allowed by law. You can freely possess cannabis to some amount. I think it's 5 grams or 30 grams. You will not be charged for it when you're arrested, unless you're trying to sell it. Once you start trying to sell it, you will be arrested for it. But So the point is that there is cannabis on the street kind of available for science as well. So we are able to research that. In Holland we have that weird name, but it's a coffee shop, the coffee shop system, but we have those shops where cannabis is being sold. The selling of the cannabis is not illegal. However, the buying by the retailer is illegal. It's still the weird situation we're having there. But once the cannabis is there and it's available for science, so it's one of the things we did in bigger researches. We collected samples from all those coffee shops to start researching so the hygiene of the product, for instance, or the contamination of the product, but also things like we are doing now, finding similar varieties and see where they are coming from and where we can find the genetics of those, etc., etc. And we are using that as a part of it. And Arno wants to add more.
Yeah, because where that connects to my previous comment is that we're not just doing something that's a very fixed, small study. We're doing studies among populations. We're trying to find out where they get the samples. We take some to the lab. We try to have a discussion with the government. So we're kind of like slowly figuring out what's our legal moving space. And then we come to a conclusion, or maybe we see what we could do. But it's a very careful explorational way of doing things. And we always have to stay within the law, but sometimes the law was never designed for these situations, so nobody really knows what the law says. So in order to figure it out, we have to start talking about it, but we can only talk when we have some facts. If we just have a weird idea, then why would the government get involved? So we already have to know something about what we're going to do, so we have to kind of understand about varieties and terpenes. So it's kind of weaving in and out of what's barely legal, but that's how you collect scientific ideas until you come to a conclusion like, oh, now I think I know what my experiment should be about.
And in return, the government is making use of the results of that research. We see that happening every time. So the results, for instance, that coffee shop cannabis is contaminated with all kinds of stuff. It's being mentioned in governmental papers even. So it goes either way.
So I think, feel free to correct me if I'm mistaken, but so a lot of us are avid readers at Bombay Hemp Company, and interestingly, one of the things we learned through our research was that, of course, the country of Israel has done a lot of work in the medicinal sphere. They've anandamide, a lot of different terms came out, endocannabinoid systems. But incidentally enough, the Dr. Rafi Mikulim, when the first supply of cannabis, and if I'm not mistaken, that he got access to, was some hashish he procured from a policeman.
5 kgs of hash that he got to carry in a bus.
Precisely. And this kind of dichotomy is something that, say, in the 70s and 80s would have been a prevalent phenomenon. But now we're at an evolved phase. We're at a phase where the likes of the Netherlands are thought leaders, where they understood these backdoor problems, if I'm not mistaken is what it's called there. These backdoor problems can not necessarily have to be looked at as problems, but they could offer an alternative solution to perhaps material that would not have conventionally come into the hands of somebody working in this medicinal domain. So a lot of the history has actually begun from incidents like this, and they perhaps wouldn't have led us to where we are today. So I'll open it up. Any other questions? We'd be happy to take a few more. Perfect. So I have one last question. I think we'll conclude on this note. We've all spoken about this, and we see such distinguished stakeholders. We have Mr. Kala, we have the likes of Mr. Bhattacharji. Of course, we have the distinguished representatives from All India Institute of Medicinal Sciences. We have everybody in this room from a variety of different fields. Now, my question coming back to everybody is, do you feel, and more importantly, how much do you feel the role of a thought leadership vehicle, like think tanks or organizations which represent a collective or public opinion, could have in matters like of this accord, which are so nascent or so new or young in a country like India?
May I answer that before?
Please, sir, please feel free.
We all know the history of NDPS Act. We all know the history of its amendments, right? And we also know about the evolvement of the NDPS policy. Now, we are also trying to formulate national alcohol policy. It will be a surprise to many that so far in India we did not have national alcohol policy. Now, after a lot of efforts, we have been able to persuade Ministry of Social Justice and Empowerment to constitute a body to formulate national alcohol policy for India. And nobody is yet thinking of national cannabis policy, so it's not in anybody's, not mind, not paper. Now the question is that about the think tank, the question which you had asked the panel. I'm sure that if there is a think tank which has established its credibility, like the way we have done for the national alcohol policy, that if such kind of think tank, NGO or some such institution is there, the ministry makes effort to include that in the committee. So if there is some think tank available someday, I'm sure that the think tank would find its place in that committee whenever it is formed.
You see many organized attempt, or you see many no will to listen because they already know how things work for themselves. Then you have a problem. And then you have to go to the politician and bring them in. But that's also a hard game, quite often. No, it's more important to bring the disciplines together here, as we see the medical and the pharmaceutical people coming in. We see people that are knowledgeable on the plant material itself, knowledgeable on the history, especially. And in that regard, every country has its own perspective also. So I think the historical background in India is massive, is huge, and that totally changes the game here compared to what is happening in Western Europe or in the United States, wherever. And I think in that regard, it is a matter for the initiative here and maybe your company even to say, okay, let's find a group of people that actually can represent India internally once we are also talking to the outer world, because that discussion needs to happen also, of course.
Certainly. Mr. Kala, Mr. Bhattacharji, any parting thoughts with respect to this final question?
No, I just endorse what Dr. Mahajan said. In fact, just to give you an example, there is an NGO known as the Lawyers Collective.
Yes, yes.
And they did a lot of work on issues relating to decriminalizing certain aspects of drug consumption and all that. So if you look at that analogy, maybe
yes,
on the scientific and medicinal side also, if there were such an organization which sort of postulated certain ideas to the government, I'm sure government is not impervious to suggestions from think tanks and other institutions. Thank you.
Definitely. So, any thoughts, Mr. Bhattacharji?
I just wanted to add to him what he has said. The Lawyers Collective last year was involved in discussions with the government for a while, but then they were discontinued.
Yeah, their license got cancelled. Their funding license got
That is it. This present government has cancelled it.
Exactly. And I think on a parting note, I think this is a good opportunity to conclude this on a parting note. And Mr. Erkelens summed it up pretty well, that this day and these representatives, the ones unfortunately who could not be here, the ones who had to leave, and of course the ones who have been here, I think this is the opportunity for India to look at what form of think tank or what type of institution with the collective minds and brains in this room can represent India's point of view in a much stronger way moving forward. And yes, of course, Arno, I think Arno has a parting conclusion.
Well, the conclusion is more a question, because I've been listening to experts here all day from many different fields, and it was very refreshing. But I think one expert has not really expressed their own opinion, and that's BOHECO themselves. Because you've been traveling around and looking at many different places and systems and companies, and of course your opinion comes through a little bit in the questions and the way you modify the panels. But what is your main conclusion that you picked up from all this traveling? Is there something that sticks out in your team that's a topic that comes back again and again?
Well, I mean, that's a good question. You put me in a spot here, Arno, a little bit, I think. But very frankly, I think we discuss this a lot in our personal and professional capacities. And one thing we all have as a common mindset is these platforms and these forums are only a stepping stone. They are supposed to act as a stepping stone to create the right kind of framework where a policy innovation or a liberalization leading to acts like decriminalization take forth. But in that sense, BOHECO is only one spoke in the whole wheel. Every single stakeholder, as a spoke in a wheel, has equal importance. And majorly because of that, getting the right kind of positivity out of people, and most importantly, addressing any form of cynicism that exists within the pre-existing system is the highest imperative. Because once that is addressed, ideas like a think tank or ideas like organizations collecting to have legislative discussions or decisions which can have an impact on government and impact on the country's future is definitely the road ahead. But that road cannot be taken alone as just us, and that road requires us to be hand in hand with the right people who have the right mentality and who are doing it for the right reasons to take a concept like medical cannabis forward. So in summation, that's where we're at. Of course, innovation is the key to what we think from the policy and the science angle, and openness is the crucial factor behind which people gather and throng around a community like this to address this more emphatically, decisively, in a step-by-step manner. So, yes, I think that's pretty much a summation of BOHECO's thoughts. So, I would just request the panelists to hold back for 1 minute. We have a few mementos to present to them as something of thanks. Divya, if we could just...